Of course, the Quran, as it repeatedly states, was revealed in the Arabic language. And so to be properly understood, we need to be, for us to properly understand it, we need to be aware of the full range of how the Arabs used their language, especially at the time of revelation. And so one of these basic dichotomies in the language is al-Haqeeqah wal-majaaz. And as we mentioned earlier, al-Haqeeqah, which comes from the word al-Haq, which means to be stable, unchanging, and thus true, that's the root word, and al-Haqeeqah means reality. And in this context, it means the literal meaning of words. And we mentioned that there are two basic approaches to how to define the literal meaning. One is the original meaning of the word. And there was an objection made to that, which is you weren't around when the language was created or put in place. So who are you to say what the original meanings of these words are? But there's a basic principle that we can take as an axiom for these issues, which is that that which can be pointed at and touched and perceived, if there's a word that deals with something on that level, and then there are other meanings of that word which are more abstract, then the more physical and tangible meaning is the Haqeeqah meaning, or the Zahir meaning, the dominant meaning. And you see that process in children. They learn by pointing at things, and the same thing in when you're learning a foreign language. The easiest things to pick up are the words that you can point at, and it's only after a certain amount of development of a child's mind or a certain amount of development of vocabulary on the part of an adult that you can start to get into these other areas which are more abstract. And so in order to, as a fallback position to that criticism that you weren't there when the language was put in place, so who are you to say what was the original meaning of any word? There's a second definition of al-Haqeeqah, which is the first thing that comes to mind when in the mind of a native speaker when they hear a given word. And this is review, but it's important to reiterate again that Haqeeqah, or Haqiqi, and that which is literal, it has two major classifications, which is linguistic Haqeeqah, al-Haqeeqah lughawee, which means that again, that's what the word originally meant in the language. And so the classic example is lion for a predatory animal. And then you have the Haqeeqah that is customary. And that custom can be general or particular. So general custom, the word dabba, it originally meant anything that moves with legs. So an insect is a dabba because it has 6 legs and it crawls. And a human being is a dabba in that sense also because it has two legs and it walks. But the term became so associated in common usage with beasts of burden, riding animals like horses, camels, donkeys, mules, that when you hear the word dabba, I mean, that's just the first thing that comes to mind. Another example of a shift from the original Arabic now to contemporary Arabic is the word walad. Walad literally means a person who's born, a child, and it can be used for male or female child. But in contemporary usage, it would be very strange for someone to use walad for a girl, whereas originally it could be used for either. And so that's general customary usage. It shifted the word from an original linguistic meaning to the first thing that comes to mind when people use it after the shift. And so after the shift, to call a riding animal a dabba, that would be the literal meaning. And to use dabba now to refer to an insect would be a figurative usage in the normal context. And then you have these special terminologies of particular groups of people, so that, as we mentioned earlier, marfu' means a special thing to grammarians, and it means another special thing to scholars of hadith. And in our experience, I mean, I'm not speaking about Arabic now, but we have in the contemporary world and the English-speaking world, we have subcultures. So that, for instance, African Americans in the United States, they have their own meaning for words, like the word trifling. It has a very specific meaning to African Americans. That the dominant culture doesn't understand the word in that way. And similarly with teenagers, they invent words, and sometimes they give old words new meanings, like that. So that's what's called urfun lughawiyun khas, or Haqeeqah urfiyya khasa, a specific custom of a limited group of people. And then for our purposes, there's a specific customary usage of words, which is critical for understanding Sharia texts, which is Sharia customary Haqeeqah. So a word like salat, which originally meant to pray, as in the first thing that comes to mind when an English speaker hears the word pray, it means supplication. But that special format of salat with qiyam and ruku and sajda and recite Qur'an when you're standing but not in ruku, not in sajda, all of those aspects of what we know to be salat in Islam, that was a shifting of the word from its original linguistic meaning to a specific meaning in Sharia context. And so occasionally you have words like salat and sawm and zakat that are used in a Sharia context to mean their original linguistic meanings. And when that is the case, then the use of those words according to the linguistic meaning is now a majazi meaning, because the literal meaning in a Sharia context is that salat refers to those acts, those special acts, that zakat refers to giving 2.5% of your wealth to the poor, etc. Siyam, Sawm, refers to refraining from food and drink and intercourse between the hours of crack of dawn until sunset. So the Prophet ﷺ, examples of usages in the Sharia context of terms which are they're being used according to their linguistic meaning, and therefore it's a majazi meaning. There's some difference of opinion about this, but anyway, example, that the Prophet ﷺ, he came one day and he asked Aisha in the morning, he said, "Is there anything to eat?" She said, "We don't have anything." He said, فَإِنِّي صَائِمٌ, then I'm fasting. So it could mean fasting in the Sharia sense, or it could mean fasting in the sense that I'm not eating. And so there's a difference of opinion among scholars about whether that kind of a nafil fast is valid if you don't make the intention in the night. And then if one of you is invited to eat, he should accept the invitation. فَإِنْ كَانَ صَائِمًا فَلْيُصَلِّ. In case he's fasting, he should pray. He's sitting there with the other people. It doesn't mean he gets up and starts making salat, but that he should make supplication for his hosts. And then in Surah Tawbah, خذ من أموالهم صدقة تطهرهم وتزكيهم بها وصل عليهم إن صلاتك سكن لهم. Take alms of their wealth, wherewith you may purify them and may make them grow, and pray for them. صل عليهم. Indeed, your prayer is a source of peace for them. Iqbal's word, an aswajment, very complicated word. Verse 103 from Surah At-Tawbah. Again, there's some difference of opinion about that, what it means exactly, but it's a very common tafsir to say that it's a majazi meaning of salat, meaning that the word is being used according to its original linguistic meaning. And in a Sharia context, that's called majaaz. And so majaaz, as we mentioned in the previous lecture, is also known as metaphorical usage or metonymy, a word used in a transferred sense. So the word is not being used according to its dominant meaning. And one can only turn to the majazi or metaphorical meaning when a qarina is present. Qarina meaning some clue to indicate that the literal meaning is not intended. An example from poetry, Shamsun tudhilluni min ash-shams, a poet praising a man, obviously, because there's not two suns in the sky. So to say that a sun who is shading me from the sun, it doesn't make sense. If that first sun is the sun in the sky, then what's the other sun? So obviously, Shams here is not referring to that celestial body, but to a man. Now, of course, it's well known that Ibn Taymiyyah, he denied that there was majaz in the Arabic language at all. And there's, of course, the majority of scholars say that majaz is present in the language, and it's also present in the text of the Quran and the Sunnah. And there's an intermediate position which says that it's there in the language, but it's not in the text of the Quran and the Sunnah. And Ibn Taymiyyah's the reason that he went after majaaz was because it was a tool in the toolkit of the Mu'tazila and the Asha'ira in dealing with the attributes of Allah, which the apparent wording gives indications of anthropomorphic attributions to Allah, what are called the sifat al-khabariyah. So the methodology of the Mu'tazila in particular was they said you have to make ta'wil, you have to reinterpret these wordings, these texts, in order to deny the apparent linguistic meaning. And what they would do is they would specify what exactly is meant in place of the apparent linguistic meaning. And so to nail that door shut, Ibn Taymiyyah, he said, well, there's just no majaaz, period, in the language. Now, the way he dealt with all of the texts that were presented as proof that there is majaaz in the language was that he said, once you have a qarina, once you have a clue that indicates that that word in this context means such and such, then that is the literal meaning in that context. So, that's an issue of classification, really. I mean, are you going to call it majaaz or not? As Omar said, "Samuhu ma shittum," yani call it whatever you want. When the Banu Taghlib, they said, we don't want to pay jizya, we're going to pay you double what's normally jizya, and we want it to be called zakat. And he said, "Samuhu ma shittum," yani call it whatever you want.